We're here as part of our Parents of the Field study with our friend and colleague, Professor David Singer of the University of Michigan. And we're talking about the origins of the field of peace studies or conflict conflict analysis and resolution. There's really no need to introduce Professor Singer, so I'm just going to go straight into the first question, which is, David, you know, in the early days of peace and conflict studies, people came in from a wide variety of different intellectual backgrounds. What was yours, and how did you come into the field in those days?
Interesting question. I'm not sure I can answer it in sufficient detail, but some people say that since my birthday was Pearl Harbor Day, it was my 16th birthday, and like most American kids in 1941, the idea of war was fairly glorious, and I immediately announced that I was going to enlist as soon as I was 17. To make a long story short, on my 17th birthday, I went down to the Navy recruiting station and did sign up. I signed up for a program that would have let me finish high school. I still had about a year to go. And then I would start training to become an aircraft carrier pilot. And that was considered the hottest thing in those days. So, and that was the one that was most competitive. So as a matter of fact, I did start out in the Navy in late '43. I spent 8 months in flight prep school. And when I saw the boys in the class ahead of me dying in training and going down in fiery crashes, I thought that wasn't so smart. So I applied to get transferred into training to become a deck and gunnery officer, which I did. They sent me to Duke University to finish my alleged education, and then the war ended just before we finished, but I signed on for another year, spent a year at sea on the battleship Missouri. I was too young to be on it for the signing of the peace treaty. As a matter of fact, I should confess that when we heard about the Japanese surrender, a lot of the boys in my class were, with me, a little bit disappointed. We had invested heavily in our training, and most of us had very romantic notions about what it would be to be a naval officer out there in the Pacific. And so in any event, I signed on for another year, spent that year mostly in the Arctic and the North Atlantic. We were trying out cold weather gear, and we were chasing Russian submarines. Then one night we had a terrible accident in which my ship was hit with star shell duels from another Navy ship. We had big explosion, big fires, and this is, I think it's important in my story. I was off to the deck after this accident. We had peeled off from the rest of the task group, and we were sailing alone in the Arctic. The surgeon called up from sick bay and asked me if I could bring the ship to a smoother course, which was kind of interesting. I immediately did so. The captain was on the bridge, and he said, "Singer, what are you doing?" And I repeated the conversation. He said, "You wouldn't do this in wartime, would you?" And I said something smart aleck like, "Captain, I think you don't know, but the war's over." Which, in any event, he made me put the ship back on the earlier course. The man who was being operated on died, and it turned out to be my own chief petty officer. So that was a rather traumatic experience. And the next day then I went in to see the captain and told him I wanted to get out of the Navy. And he said he was happy to oblige. And a few months later, we were back in the States, and I got released to inactive duty. Then, to carry the story a little bit further, in about 1948, the people at NYU, New York University, started a graduate program called United Nations in World Affairs. It was at night and weekends. And I was then working in New York. I had a full-time job, but I was also up to my ears in the World Federalist Movement. Shortly after I came out of the Navy in '46, began to find out what was going on between the Russians and ourselves, and it was very clear to me that American policy was no more sensible than Russian policy. And that led me to think that we needed to strengthen the UN and we needed to make the superpowers behave better. So I then, for the next 3 years, I was going to school at night, finished a master's, had been active in the World Federalists and other peace groups during those years. And then when the Korean War erupted, I decided I'd better go back on active duty. At the time, I was the training officer for construction battalion. And I didn't want to be a CB officer out in Korea, because that's very dangerous and you're very vulnerable. And you're in forward areas without any weapons of your own. So I contacted a friend of mine in the Pentagon and told him that if he could get me reclassified back as a gunnery officer, I'd immediately volunteer. And a couple of weeks later, that was done. A week or two after that, I was on a new ship in Norfolk, Virginia, on a heavy cruiser called the Newport News. We expected to go to Korea, but we didn't. At the last minute, we were transferred to the Sixth Fleet, the Mediterranean Fleet. And I spent the next 12 months out there. Very interesting, very informative. No combat, but a lot of good experience. And then I had another run-in with another commanding officer who had taken over our ship after about a year that I'd been there. And this fellow was really a wreck. He hadn't been to sea since the end of World War II. A very high-strung, high-anxiety guy. And the ship was really going to hell in a week. So the other officers came to me and said, I'll never forget this, Singer, you're the most senior reserve officer on the ship. You've got to go tell the captain to shape up. And my first reaction was, I'm not going to touch that. We know a lot about mutiny in the Navy. I thought about it for a day or two, and then I thought, I've got to do something. I'm not going to stay in the Navy. Because, again, it was a quick decision, even though I'd thought seriously about a career after World War II. And I thought seriously again at the end of the Korean War. But seeing what this guy could do, I thought, this is crazy. So I went in to see him, tried to tell him in a fairly reverent way that he was really screwing up the world's best ship. And he was livid. And he assured me he'd get me off that ship the first thing he could. And we were back in the States maybe a month or two later, and there were orders for me to be transferred. And they made me an instructor of seamanship at the Officers Candidate School. This would have been about 1953. And to make a long story short, I was a very successful teacher, which I didn't know I could do. And I decided, well, I've got an MA in world politics. I'm going to go back to graduate school, get a PhD, and study and teach. Well, I indeed did that. I was told that you better go to either Columbia or Harvard. A PhD from NYU is not worth much. But on the other hand, Columbia and Harvard were willing to take me, but they wanted me to start all over again. And by then I was, let's say, 26 years old, a little old to be a first-year graduate student. So I finished at NYU, got my first job teaching at Vassar College, was by then still very active in the World Federalists. And I can continue, but the story goes on.
Well, why don't you tell me how you got involved in the program here at Michigan? Because
Good, okay.
That's been something that a lot of people have sort of either they've had experience in, or they point to as being a crucial stage in the development of whatever the field is going to be called, and I'll come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
So how did you get involved in that?
This talk about serendipity in people's lives and careers. At Vassar, I had a very gifted young student whose name was Rosemary Kleinberg. Her daddy was Otto Kleinberg, very famous psychologist. She liked what I was teaching so much that she took me home to her parents. They lived not too far from Poughkeepsie. I was there at a dinner party. After the dinner party, Otto asked me to stay around a little bit. And when the guests had gone, and the guests included Margaret Mead and a whole bunch of other very distinguished anthropologists and psychologists. He said, young man, you've got a great future ahead of you, but you've got to do two things. First, you've got to improve your French. It's really abysmal, which I agreed. But then more seriously, he said, and you've got to learn more about scientific method. And I already was beginning to be aware of that. He then told me that the Ford Foundation had a program for historians and political scientists to tool up in the behavioral sciences and in modern methods. And he said, if you apply, I'll give you a recommendation. I did, and he did. And that gave me a whole year at Harvard in the social relations department, where I really did nothing but study and learn. And as a matter of fact, my mentor was none other than young Herbert Kellman.
Really?
Whose name you will probably recognize. Herb was younger than I, had just finished his own PhD, and had won the Kurt Levine Award for the best dissertation in social psychology that year.
Oh, he never mentioned that.
Yes, it was a brilliant dissertation. It did lead to a couple of interesting published articles. So spending a year with Herb and some of the other peaceniks up there, and of course that's when I think was my first meeting with John Burton.
As early as that?
I think so. I was still quite active in the World Federalists. I had certainly spent time with Roger Fisher, and then a very gifted young biologist by the name of Matthew Meselson. He's famous for showing that during the Vietnam War, what was being claimed by the Americans as poison was nothing but bee droppings. You may remember that famous story.
That, the Yellow Rain story.
Exactly, yes. So the year at Harvard was very interesting. Then there was a conference toward the end of that year in Boston. One of the speakers was Kenneth Boulding. I was one of the speakers as well. He and I were chatting after the thing, and he asked me if I had a job for next year, and I said no. He said, there's a one-year opening at Michigan in political science. You should apply. And he'd already told me about plans for the Center for Research on Conflict Resolution. That sounded to me like exactly my dish of tea. And as a result, I applied for the job, was interviewed, got the job, arrived at Michigan in, let's say, late summer of 1958. Was immediately contacted by Dean Pruitt, who was one of the psychologists working with Boulding and with Elise Boulding and Daniel Katz, Bob Angel, and he invited me to come to the conflict resolution seminars, which I was delighted to do. We used to meet, I'd say, once every week. Kenneth usually held forth at the beginning. Elise was the rapporteur. And the more I listened to what these other people were doing, the more engaged I became. And so I was quite active in helping get the center started. The journal was already underway and was off to a reasonably promising start. But I had a lot of trouble. The political science department was very hostile to the creation of the center, and you can see why. Even though the scheme was to study war and peace in a detached scientific way, the political scientists, who were, I like to say, well embedded in the Cold Warrior class, thought that you don't need to do any research on this, comrades. It's very simple. It's the good guys and the bad guys, and it's us against the Russians. So what kind of research are you doing? You fellows must be subversive. And the chairman several times called me aside, dressed me down, and said, you've got to decide. Are you a political scientist or a peace researcher? And I insisted that I thought I could be both. He frowned a lot. He gave me a tremendous amount of grief during the first year. For example, I gave a public talk before the Ann Arbor Women's City Club, looked out at this audience. I would say a third of these ladies were pregnant. And I was talking about testing of nuclear weapons. That was what I'd been asked to talk about. And when I described some of the deleterious effects of cesium and strontium-90 and so forth, a lot of these people didn't know anything about that. The chairman called me in the next day and he said, "What do you know about nuclear weapons?" And I said, "Well, I've done a lot of homework." He said, "Well, that's not enough. You don't know anything about it. Shut up." And as the year wore on, I was in more and more hot water with him, but I was more and more committed to what Angel and Boulding and the boys at Conflict Resolution wanted to do. And I was already very committed to the whole idea of peace research, even though I was never committed to peace studies. Several years later, if I can shorten the story a bit, I ended up back. I was fired at the end of my second year in the poli-sci department here, and happily by then I had 2 job offers. One to go full-time into the Mental Health Research Institute here as a full-time researcher. And it really was not mental health as much as general systems. It was a very exciting, creative bunch of people, and you know some of those folks. In the interim, I had an offer to teach at the Naval War College in Rhode Island for 6 months. I had already accepted that job, so I made a deal with the Mental Health Research Institute, whose director was James Greer Miller, and I had a very interesting time teaching at the War College. I gave a number of lectures that got me into big trouble. My inaugural lecture, I decided I would show the similarities between Soviet and American strategic policy, which was not politically very prudent. And at the end of my lecture, I'll never forget this. Normally, American naval officers are very courteous, and I would have expected a lot of applause. They sat on their hands. The auditorium was silent. And then finally, one officer, one captain got up and applauded, and then a few others did. That was it. I should probably say that prior to my lecture, this was probably during what they call Global Strategy Week. The earlier speaker was what I always call Wild Bill Elliott, William Yandell Elliott, a very ardent Cold Warrior, retired Army, I think it was Army General. And just as I was going up to the podium to start my lecture, he jumped out of his chair, walked up, very large man, pushed me aside and said, "Gentlemen, I would like to introduce the spokesman for the Surrender Lobby," which created a little bit of a set of expectations. I nevertheless went ahead with my lecture. As I say, I finished to deafening silence. The next day, the Admiral, Bernard Austin, made a public statement saying that he thought it was a terrific lecture and that naval officers ought to hear these perspectives. And it's funny, he had actually ended up his career in a fairly dramatic way. He chaired the Board of Inquiry when the first American submarine sunk. I don't remember the name of it now. It would have been in, I believe, the early 60s. And it sunk, I think, off the New Hampshire coast. So I finished my tour of duty there. While I was there, I wrote the first draft of a book called Deterrence, Arms Control, and Disarmament, which was my effort to look at military strategy in a somewhat more symmetric way, and of course a much less jingoistic way. I remember then I came back to Michigan, made some final changes in the draft, sent the book off to, I think it was American publisher, I think it was Knopf. And after about 2 months, the editor phoned me and he said, "Young man, this is a great book, but I can't touch it. It would get me into trouble." I then sent it to another American publisher, got exactly the same response. I then sent it to Ohio State Press, which had announced a competition for the best book on national security policy. And there was a very interesting culmination. There were 3 men on that committee. I remember the names of 2 of them. One was, I think one of them was Joe Coffey. I think another was Richard Snyder. And another was, he was on the faculty at Columbia, but he was in the National Security Council under President Kennedy. In any event, they told me that they thought it was the best book of the year, but they couldn't possibly publish it. They couldn't possibly give it a prize because the Mershon Center that was sponsoring it had money from a retired Army officer who had recruited a bunch of very hawkish military historians. So the book got published by Ohio State Press. It was, I guess it was my first, it must have been my second book. I'd already published a book on financing the League and the United Nations.
Was that your PhD, or was it?
The financing book was my PhD.
Okay.
The deterrence book was a labor of love. And it was an effort really to meet the hawks as far as I could go on their assumptions, most of which I thought were preposterous. But I was willing to grant them that and still try to demonstrate that the arguments they made were dangerous and ill-founded. And in the book, I spoke about the dangers of ballistic missile defense. I certainly wrote about the dangers of developing any kind of first strike strategy. And I also wrote about the dangers of fallout and evacuation plans. I might say that subsequently to the publishing of the book, I was approached by a company here in Ann Arbor called Bendix Systems Division. It was kind of a consulting firm. It's a firm that originally was in the business of pneumatic brakes, but they had spread out, and they had a division that was doing national security. And they asked me if I would be a consultant. I'd already met some of these fellows. I'd helped them put on a conference, the first international control on arms control and disarmament. It was international because we had one Canadian and one Russian. And it was not very international, but it was an interesting conference. And the men out there liked what I said, and I began to work with them as a consultant. Did classified work, actually wrote a minority report on civil defense and why I thought it was a bad idea. Later on, I wrote another minority report on why ballistic missile defense was a bad idea. And that allegedly went all the way up to the office of the Secretary of Defense, who by then was Robert McNamara. I might say Ann Arbor's favorite son. So that's pretty much how I got into this. And I guess one more connection is that somewhere in about 1962, Kenneth Boulding was able to raise a little bit of outside money, and he asked those of us connected to the center what we would do with this money. And he asked us to write up short research designs, and I wrote up my design, which was I was going to go back to the work of Lewis Richardson in England and Quincy Wright in University of Chicago, and was going to start a research project building on what they did. And to make that story short, I got a grant, it was a very small grant, and got about, I think, about $30,000 for 2 years. And I called a couple of my colleagues over in the history department. I asked them to send me their best grad students. And among those was a lad named Melvin Small. And Small and I got started on the project. The first task, of course, was to identify all international wars since 1816. I decided that was a good historical cutting point. Once we got started on that, I had a fellowship arranged by Johan Galtung. I had a Fulbright to spend the year at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo, which was also then under construction. And it was a very interesting, challenging year. There were some very good Norwegian social scientists. Galtung, as you can imagine, was an interesting, if provocative colleague. So that was a very good year. When I came back, Mel Small and the other assistants had finished the first phase of the project. And that's really how the project got started.
Okay, that's that story. What happened to the center here? I've always sort of wondered about. It was so influential on so many people, and then suddenly it wasn't there anymore.
That's right. Well, Chris, it was not sudden. The center was in trouble from day one, partly because the political science department was very hostile and had resisted its creation. Nevertheless, there was enough support in different parts of the campus. The dean liked the idea. Bob Angel, the sociologist, had a tremendous amount of prestige, and he came from the Angel family, for which our major buildings have been named. Bob Angel was an absolutely marvelous, powerful guy, very intelligent. He took people like myself under his wing because he could see that we were endangered species from day one. If I can digress, the chairman of our department was James K. Pollock, a very conventional, brilliant guy, but quite right-wing, I would say, certainly an enthusiastic Cold Warrior and a good Bolshevik basher. And he mobilized a number of the men in my department to also criticize. And at the same time, there were two political scientists who would occasionally come to the seminars. One was Russ Fifield, and the other was Harold Jacobson. Neither of these gents is still alive. I guess I can say that they were not really very enthusiastic. But another problem was that Ken Boulding was probably as indifferent to administration and budgeting as a man could be. So even though he was brilliant, charismatic, fascinating, constructive person, he alienated a lot of people. For example, Ken used to periodically, I have to smile, chain himself to the flagpole in the middle of the campus to demonstrate how America had become a prisoner of war. And you can imagine some of the criticism, some of the complaints. And there were a lot of the chairmen of the departments in those days. Remember, we're looking at, what, 1964 maybe. And in those days, a lot of the Michigan departments were headed not by chairs, but by heads. And in the American system, a head really was a lifetime tenure. And most of these heads ran their departments like little fiefdoms. And I remember Jim Pollock had among his allies the chairman of the English department and the chairman of the anthropology department. And that was a little bit of a right-wing troika. So the center was under the gun. Then, because Ken was not a conscientious administrator, and I guess Bob Angel didn't want to do it, the administration was left to these two young guys, Bob Hefner and Bill Barth, and they were both very progressive in their politics, rather casual about running the budget. And among the things that happened was, first of all, at the end of each fiscal year, we were incapable of accounting for the little bit of money we were getting from the university, which can cause a little bit of trouble. And then in the late 60s, 67, 68, the Black Action Movement was getting organized on this campus. And these were African American students, some not students, quite militant. And Barth and Hefner, to the best of my recollection, invited the Black Action Movement leaders to join in and share the little headquarters we had. We had a small old cottage on the campus. And these fellows were brought in, and about the same time, another radical group called the Students for Democratic Society, SDS, and some of these militant youngsters like Tom Hayden, and one of the, I can't remember the other boy's name right now, also were encouraged to use the facilities. We were also publishing the journal out of the same little building. It was an absolutely charming little place. The morale and the camaraderie was great. A lot of us had lunch together a couple of times a week. There was a very senior man from the journalism department who was one of our supporters. And then later on, a younger journalist named William Porter, who had come to Michigan from Iowa. And so the journal was there, the center was there, and I could see the center was in trouble. About that time, I decided that it was time to turn the center over to real professionals. My reasoning being that psychologists and sociologists who were very interested but didn't have the scientific scholarly background. And I agreed with the political scientists that this really was a political science discipline problem, war and peace. See, we were not particularly worried about domestic conflict, interpersonal conflict, or even racial affairs until later on. We were primarily interested in the Cold War and what kind of research could we do that might shed some light on this major power arms race, major power arms rivalry, by studying history in a systematic way. And so that's exactly what I was doing. I then persuaded my colleagues that we should bring in a senior political scientist who had a lot of experience as an administrator and would have more credibility with the political science department. I persuaded my friend Charles McClelland, who was then at Southern California, as I remember, to take the job. He had a joint appointment in the center and in the Department of Political Science. Not everybody in the department was delighted with this. He got here, two things went wrong. First, his kids did not like the cold weather, and they proceeded hot-footed back to sunny California. Not long after that, as I remember, his wife went back, and then at the same time, he was getting flack from the other political scientists. He was not enjoying the camaraderie, which I enjoyed only partially because I was certainly a pariah in the department. But it's an interesting thing. If you're a successful teacher and you're publishing well, they cut you a lot of slack, which means that I was able to get away with my fellow traveling pro-communist research. And so McClellan stayed only one academic year, and he left.
And he went back to USC.
He went back to California. At that point, I'm not even sure who became the acting director, but whoever it was not very capable. And by then, Pollock had been able to get one of the men in my department by the name of George Grassmuck, a very nice guy, but a Republican who had already served or soon would serve in the Nixon White House. George became something like vice provost for international affairs, and his job was to dismantle the center. And he found it a very easy task because the center had very little support on the campus. They were unable to account for the money. They had taken in two other groups that were considered too radical. And in due course, the regents were persuaded to take away the charter of the center, and that was that.
Okay. But that left you high and dry in the political science department.
Well, not quite. You talk about serendipity. Remember, I mentioned that after I was fired at the end of my second year in political science, Jim Miller and his men and women over at the Mental Health Research Institute hired me, and I had what I thought was a tender job as what's called a senior research associate. And when I came back from Oslo, which would have been 1964, I came back half-time in mental health and half-time in political science. This was a very fortunate thing. When Pollock was finally eased out of the chairmanship, he was replaced by Arthur Bromage. This was about the middle of my year in Oslo, and Arthur sent me a cable inviting me back into the department with tenure, half-time. And of course, never has a telegram been responded to so quickly, because I would say that for the following 22 years, I had the best political science job in the country, if not in the whole Western world. It was an absolutely marvelous job, teaching half-time, on and off chairing the World Politics program in political science, getting a lot of writing and research done. The Correlates of War project was moving along, and I think I can say that by the late 70s, our project had begun to encourage and spin off a lot of similar research in England, in Scandinavia, in Japan, in Germany, and I guess that's about it. So there we are. I would say the center is dead, but the Correlates of War project is alive and well.
Sure.
I was able to bring in outside money, largely from, this is an interesting point, National Science Foundation. Now, most laymen would think that a government agency would be the most careful and anxious about research that looks a little bit unpatriotic. But they were terrific, which I cannot say for Ford, Rockefeller, Carnegie, or MacArthur. Over the years, I have seen almost nothing from any of the private foundations. I once had a small grant from, I can't forget, one of the smaller foundations. But much of my funding came from National Science Foundation. And they liked what we were doing. And of course, we had no trouble getting published, which was also a very pleasant surprise. And I was publishing in pre-scientific journals like World Politics, Journal of Politics, International Security, as well as our more, let's say, our house journals, which would be the Journal of Conflict Resolution, Journal of Peace Research from Oslo, Conflict Management and Peace Science, which from the Peace Science group, and another journal called International Interactions, and even International Studies Quarterly. I might even say that our group, let's call us the quantitative peace researchers, really were able to dominate the International Studies Association. So much so that I was elected its president in, I guess I would say the late 1970s. In my early years as an instructor at Vassar College, I came out there thinking, well, I've got a PhD, I'm well educated, I know a lot of diplomatic history, I know a lot of military history, I know a lot of international law. I'm going to really be able to answer questions about foreign policy, war and peace, and so forth. And by the time I was in my second year teaching at Vassar, which was a place that attracted, it was an all-women's college in those days, and these students were not only very smart, they were very precocious. They asked really good questions. I mean, they got out of the box. And I increasingly realized that half the time I didn't know what the hell I was talking about, that I was giving them conventional historical explanations. And I was increasingly dissatisfied with them. So that when I met Professor Kleinberg, and he talked to me about tooling up in scientific method, I was already ready to join the choir. And at the end of the year at Harvard, I was really an enthusiast. I was a true behavioral scientist. And in a more contemporary language, I was a true quantoid. And by then I was beginning also, I guess by then I was more than able to see the inadequacy of most of the traditional research that had been done on war and peace, and on foreign policy, and on national security. And it seemed to me that we could do better. And that led me to go back to some of the pioneers, like Richardson and Wright, who were already telling us that you can't learn much about war and peace by just studying tidbits of history, and you couldn't use highly poetic generalizations. You needed to measure, you need to quantify, you needed to scale, and you needed to find correlations. You needed to know what goes with what. Could you reconstruct? And I felt that the peace studies folks were just as willing as the Hawks to take folklore, conventional wisdom, and their own intuitive poetic take on the lessons of history. So it was an intellectual transmission that had already been preceded by my normative transition, which is leaving the Navy, getting up to my ears in the World Federalists, which I consider to be probably the most responsible of all the many peace groups. But, we collaborated with the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the Baha'i. There were a number of peace groups. But I obviously was not yet ready to make the final plunge, because with the outbreak of the war in Korea, and myself being an active duty reserve officer, I had very little hesitation volunteering, which I did. And I must confess, I didn't volunteer solely because I wanted to see the United Nations supported and vindicated. I was in a dead end professionally. I was in a career I had no interest in. And I might even confess I was involved with a lovely young woman who was very eager to marry, and I was not eager to marry. And I have to say that when I made that decision, and my parents, my dad was, of course, quite positive. My dad had been in the Army in World War I, and also had not seen any combat. And if I can really go back to Pearl Harbor Day in 1941, my mother was very distraught. And so it was a big day in my life, because my mother was quite excited. My little brother thought it was great. And my dad, who had worked for the Japanese, he helped build their World Fair pavilion in I think it was 1936 or 7. And he said, I know these Japanese guys, and they're not very aggressive, and we'll beat them in 6 months. And my mother said, nah, but they're going to take my boys. And of course, a year later I had signed on, and a few months after that I was in training. So there was that. But in any event, I was more than willing to go back into the Navy for another 2 years. And of course, those 2 years were very important for my changing careers, because by having this run-in with the commanding officer, committing quasi-treasonable act, ending up at the Naval Officers Training School. And I remember then as a college boy, one of my professors, John Hallowell, often said to me, David, you should go into teaching. You love political science. He was a political philosopher, and I probably had 2 or even 3 courses with him, even while I was preparing to become a gunnery officer. And he and I actually stayed in good touch after I graduated and after I came out of the Navy, because I was a traveling salesman for the Southern Territory, and John was then a professor at Duke, where I'd done my undergraduate. So it was kind of in the back of my mind, but I was not serious. But then the fact that I'd finished my MA at night school before the Korean War, and had this new experience as a very successful teacher. As a matter of fact, the first article I ever published was on a mock-up that I designed and built at the Officers Candidate School to teach young officers what the technology of fueling at sea was. Tankers would come out and meet combat ships, and we'd sail alongside and set up all kinds of complicated hoses and...
I remember seeing pictures of that.
Well, that was my mock-up, and hundreds of naval officers learned to do it there. So in any event, leaving the Navy the second time, by then I was pretty close to moving in a more pacifistic direction. Subsequently, I've classified myself as a 90% pacifist, which means on rare occasions, history deals you a bad hand, and you're not intelligent or capable enough to
do anything but.
So you go to war. But since I've been teaching courses on war every semester my whole career, and we get to this question inevitably, I will always say that I conclude no war in the last 2 centuries was inevitable. Every war, international or domestic, could have been avoided, which is why I've always had strong regard for the peace studies folks, the conflict resolution folks. I didn't think that the quality of the research was good enough, but there was a lot of creativity, a lot of good ideas, and let's say, a charismatic leadership. John Burton being one, Herb Kelman being another. These were people going back to the earlier folks like Sir Norman Angell. And then in America, the man who ran for president 3 times, Norman Thomas.
Yeah. You've talked about Lewis Richardson, Quincy Wright, Sorokin, and later on people like Herb and John Burton. Who else do you think were sort of major influences on the way you think about peace research and conflict resolution? And I guess there's a second question on that. Who do you think were important figures in the field apart from the ones that had a major influence on you? So a 2-part question.
Yes. Well, I guess in terms of the people who had influence on me, beyond Wright, Richardson, Bloch, and Sorokin, then there were some of the 18th and 19th century philosophers, Condorcet, Quetelet, Buckle. These are all people that I began to read after Richardson and Wright really piqued my attention. There were probably a few people who influenced my approach to research. Perhaps Carl W. Deutsch would have been one of the most powerful, not only because he was a brilliant fellow and very, very sympathetic and supportive for the research I was doing, but we had an odd arrangement in which Jim Miller, who was the director of the Mental Health Research Institute, had met and been very taken by Carl Deutsch, and he asked me to negotiate an arrangement whereby Carl would come to the Mental Health Research Institute every month for 3 or 4 days. That deal went on for, I don't know, I would say 5 years maybe, which meant I was spending a lot of time with Carl Deutsch, learning a lot from him, being provoked by him. He was a very, very assertive, very supportive, but a tremendous command, not only of history, but a tremendous command of things as exotic. For example, one of his favorite colleagues was Norbert Wiener, the father of cybernetics. And at the same time, the associate director of our institute was a physicist named John Platt. John Platt was an absolutely marvelous guy. He was what I guess today we'd call a polymath, in the sense of a tremendous range of interests and enthusiasms. Started out in the physics of color, and but was very interested in the philosophy of science. He, as a matter of fact, he wrote a paper that was very influential in my early research career. It was called Strong Inference, in which his argument was never do an experiment or an empirical study unless you think it can change the dominant paradigm of the moment, which is a very tough standard. See, what Kuhn called normal science is very rarely done that way. Normal science is you stay with the dominant paradigm and you move it ahead by small steps. And I've always been on the cusp between these two orientations. And as enthusiastic as I was with the fantasy that my kind of project might produce the big breakthrough, it certainly has not yet, and probably won't for a while. But I'm at the point now, having officially retired, I'm at the point where I'm willing to step away from a lot of the normal science I've been doing. I might say I inevitably had to go to normal science because there was just so many gaps. There hadn't been any of the brush clearing research that would permit. We didn't have any kind of solid foundation. And when I say solid foundation, it had to be not only in terms of the historical evidence, it had to be in terms of the social science knowledge, and even genetics. As a matter of fact, it's really only the last few years that I have read enough in, let's call it evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, to be quite convinced that while humans are not hardwired for war, we are soft-wired for war, which is a way of saying that it's never going to take much to mobilize most people in most countries for war. They need to be mobilized. Sure, there are some people for whom war is inherently attractive, and there's kind of a bad joke in our business. Men like war, and girls like men who like war. And this, a German truth. And certainly in America in 1941, boy, that was so close to the truth. As a matter of fact, boys my age, if we had any interest in women, we'd better be in uniform or close to it. And those were good days in a lot of ways. And I say now, as a conditional 90% pacifist, that I don't regret my Navy experiences, because not only was there, the prestige and the excitement, but the opportunity. I mean, the amount of responsibility I had when I was 20 and a half years old. I mean, running a battleship almost all by yourself for 4 hours while you're on watch is, it's a bit of a kick, a bit of a high. So there is that. I guess I would say, though, that today I realize how readily mobilized we are, and we've got tremendous experience on that. And it's because most humans have, and this I would say is an innate result of both cultural and genetic evolution. We like hierarchy. We like pecking order. Not that most of us want to be on the top, but most of us want to know where we are. And that is a very alarming human natural predisposition for most of us. Some people would carry it further and say, we like to be regimented. I don't think that's, the evidence doesn't convince me that, but we sure like to know where we stand. And let me put in a pitch for a recent book written by Steve Peterson and Albert Sommet. And it is called, if I can reach for it, no, I can't, it's not here right now, but it's a very interesting and, for me, persuasive book. In it, Sommet and Peterson are addressing the question of expanding democracies in the third world. And they think that democratic nation building is going against the grain. And they point out that democracies can get established and thrive only when certain very special conditions are present. And they summarize a lot of the genetic evidence, which I largely share. I even was asked to write a blurb for their dust cover, which I happily did. Most people who are enthusiasts for democracy don't realize why most democracies are short-lived, and all democracies are highly imperfect. And you look at America today, the political leadership, by and large, are not people who share the democratic norm. They are not big on liberté, égalité, fraternité. These are highly manipulative people who, in other times and places, would have been the courtesans, the court comedians. As a matter of fact, it reminds me, I used to, when I was fighting in military strategy issues with the guys from RAND, I used to call them the court astrologers, because I thought that their research was so bad and their normative assumptions were so menacing. And thirdly, of course, these guys had a lot more clout than lads like myself. You can imagine how little, let's say, standing ovation and prolonged applause I would get at these meetings that dealt with national security. So on your question of the difference between peace studies and peace science, I was committed. We've got to do it the hard science way, and I still am. You can see I've not budged an inch, and yet I spent a lot of time listening to and reading the fellows whom we hard science guys, we'd say their research is squishy or soft, but it's full of good ideas. And as a matter of fact, I was talking about this new 4-volume encyclopedia that Matt Evangelista has edited. A lot of interesting ideas in there, but nothing that constitutes scientific evidence. Evidence that I would call sufficiently reproducible. So
the field, when it started, whatever we're going to call it, whether we're going to call it, peace research or conflict research or whatever, started out with the idea of becoming a social science, and I think it started with two things. One, it aspired to be a social science, and it aspired to be practical. Let's leave the practical aside for the moment. How far do you think it's come in its objectives of becoming a social science? Are we anywhere near that now?
Yes, we are. Two anecdotes. First of all, the way you juxtapose these is very nice because it illuminates the tension between applicability of a research enterprise and its scientific quality. In that connection, in the early days, both at the Journal of Conflict Resolution and more explicitly in Oslo, the Journal of Peace Research, we expected our authors in the conclusion to their papers to say, here's the policy relevance. Both journals have fallen away from that. And as a matter of fact, at the annual meetings of the Peace Science Society, by and large, we don't spend much time wrestling with the applicability of our research findings. Now, it's the more general question. Today, it is scientific. That is, if you read the journal, particularly the two journals of conflict resolution and peace research, and conflict management and peace science, and probably international interactions. International studies quarterly fluctuates more. There was a time when our crowd really dominated that journal, but I think that's changing. I think we are being edged out a little bit. And the next presidents of the International Studies Association will not be people like myself. They'll be people who are more, let's say, on the bridge between peace studies and peace science. But there's no question that right now there are lots of people, I would say more than 300 people around the world, graduate students and professors, who are doing what I would consider to be rigorous scientific research on international conflict and war and peace. And that's good. But to use the tension that you've alluded to, we have won the epistemological battle, despite the English school, the constructivists, the Foucault, and other of the French philosophes, but we have not won the applicability struggle by a long shot.
Why do you think that is?
To do good scientific research takes a tremendous amount of time, energy, attention to detail, attention to the canons of scientific method. And by the time a young scientist has crafted and published a paper like that, see, it doesn't happen to me very often anymore, although I must say last year I did have an article rejected by World Politics, by these folks. It was a very quantitative study trying to explain how nuclear weapons proliferation occurred. And the three referees just didn't like all those numbers. Also, I gathered from what the referees said, I didn't spend enough time genuflecting in front of the many, let's say, lugubrious papers those chaps had written. I've since revised the paper. I've tried to respond to the criticism, and I have a co-author, a young Japanese fellow named Atsushi Tago. And about a month ago, I submitted it to the Journal of Politics, which is a very quantitative journal, but hasn't published much stuff in international politics. It's been an Americanist journal. Although I did mention that many years ago, I did publish a few papers there. Yeah. I think that's one reason.
Yeah.
Another reason is that a lot of people, at least in America and probably in the West, say, if you're so committed to these policy issues and you're so normative, how can I take your science seriously? And I can still remember a visit to London when you were there, and a bunch of British students cornered me and said, look, you're taking money from the U.S. National Science Foundation. You're obviously not going to be doing objective science. And then another group, most of these are radical students, would say, how can you be doing objective science if you're so committed? And then, of course, in more conservative political circles in America, that question has been thrown at me many, many times. About 2 or 3 years ago, I gave some lectures down at the University of Virginia, which, as you know, is not a hotbed of radical social science.
No.
You would say, you would agree.
Not.
And the question, I was there to talk about the democratic peace, about which I'm very, very skeptical. I think what we've got there is an historical and geographical artifact. I still think that. And Mel Small and I published way back in 1976 a paper, and we were the first ones to statistically demonstrate that democracies very rarely went to war against one another. But we yawned and said, well, it's not surprising. The last 200 years, you haven't seen that many democracies. And as a matter of fact, they've not been geographically contiguous. And contiguity, despite all the changes in technology, is still almost a necessary condition for war. Yeah. So I think those things are at work. But you see, people who are, let's say, doing peace research, scientific peace research, are also in traditional social science departments, typically political science, psychology, economics, sociology, occasionally anthropology. And in order to make it in their disciplines, they've got to produce papers and books that command the conventional dominant views in their disciplines. And some of us get away with murder. But as a matter of fact, a funny story. About 5 years ago, one of my colleagues, who does very fancy quantitative work, had just gotten another prize. And I ran into him in the hall after a meeting, and then I said, Bob, what am I doing wrong? And in a completely straight face, he said, Dave, you don't publish in the right journals, by which he meant the flagship journals in American political science. I've only published, in my early days, I published maybe 10 articles in the American Political Science Review. I don't think I've published there in 15 or 20 years. Publishing in conflict resolution, peace research, ISQ, conflict management, that doesn't get you brownie points. But happily in the American academic game, you can get brownie points and get away with murder doing a number of other things. One of them is to educate and mentor graduate students who go out and make a splash. And I've been very lucky in that regard. So many of my students, going way back into the mid-60s, have been so successful. Most of them doing peace research, but doing also enough conventional stuff to get noticed, to get published, to get tenure, to sell successful textbooks and so forth. But it's an interesting ball game, and it's a balancing game. And for example, I mentioned this new collection by Evangelista. Now he's at Cornell.
Yeah, something you said about being, the tension between sort of practice and being scientific, and the tension between wanting to be rigorous and quantitative and wanting to be innovative and exploratory. And to some extent, I think your career has been an example of the tension between those two things.
That's not as tough as being policy relevant.
No, I think that's right. And the thing that has always struck me about your career is that you've always tried to be policy relevant. You've always talked to people. You've always tried to sort of look at their ideas and present some alternatives. But in spite of all of these tensions, the field, whether we're going to call it peace research or whether we're going to call it conflict resolution, has become enormously successful over the last couple of decades.
Yes.
It's grown hugely. And how do you think, going back to the sort of early days, how do you think this has sort of come about? Why do you think it has been so successful? Why do you think the ideas of some of the early people have resulted in this huge explosion of places, people, etc., etc.? And looking back, do you think this is what people envisaged in the 50s and 60s? And what do you think the field has become what the early pioneers, the parents, envisaged? Or has it fallen short in some way?
No. Chris, let me start by saying I think you're absolutely correct when you say it has really blossomed and burgeoned. And I say that with very mixed feelings, because I really consider that a very large fraction of that stuff is nothing that hasn't been said over and over and over again. As a matter of fact, I remember one anecdote that popped into my head. It was a workshop of the U.S. Institute of Peace, and a very famous labor mediator, no longer alive, was holding forth on the requirements of a successful labor conflict resolution man. And he was talking about all the things you needed. And then he said something about you needed a good bladder so you could sit at these long, drawn-out negotiations. And I said, you also needed a very visible belly button, because that's where you got most of your information. And because I was very contemptuous. What I heard him say was what you get from Dear Abby. And I have to say that some of my early graduate students, particularly the ones that were not in political science but were in social or psych, actually have become major actors in this, what I would call softer conflict resolution field. The only name I can think of off the bat is Clint Fink, but there's a very bright young Canadian guy whom I'm sure you know, short fellow with a very neat red beard.
Oh, yes, Ron
Fisher.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And both these guys were good students of mine. I used to give a graduate seminar called World Politics and the Related Disciplines, which the department decided was too much of a boutique course and required me to drop. But a lot of this stuff, you pick it up, and by the time you're in the second paragraph, you know you've been there many times. And worse yet, you know that these people are dealing with very fuzzy concepts, if you will, bottles with lots of holes in them, or carrying ideas in a sieve, no sense of reproducibility. So in a way, the early founders were already in two schools. There was the crowd that was sitting there in Palo Alto in about 1955 with Anatole Rappaport and Ken Boulding, and I believe Dean Pruitt, and I believe Herb Kelman. I'm not sure about that. Right now I'm checking these names out. But then there were your mentor, John Burton. I suppose even it's kind of interesting. Elise Boulding, I think, was much more in that camp. And of course, Kenneth himself is the most charming and attractive blend of the two, because Ken was very charismatic, creative. He was a poet. He didn't just write limericks, which he always wrote at the end of any conference. Ken would come up with a charming limerick that would capture what we'd done or make fun of what we'd done. But he stopped himself. He stopped doing quantitative work many years ago, even though he started out as a very competent and highly regarded, slightly unconventional economist. Then we had here at the University of Michigan, we had something called the Residential College. And one of the founders of that was Ted Newcomb, a social psychologist. And as I recall, Ted may even have been at the Palo Alto group, where the consensus there, I'd say, was very strong. I was not there. And I had the strong sense that what these men were saying is, we're going to study the problem of war and peace, but we're not going to do it in a soft, squishy, poetic way. We're going to study it like hard scientists. I'd like to see a continuation of commitment to rigorous methodologies, staying fairly close to normal science, a little more interest in a search for the breakthrough, even though I don't think it's likely in the short run. But I think it's terribly important to think big thoughts. As a matter of fact, when I was out there at Binghamton, Pat Regan put a very interesting question to me, and he said, how do you reconcile, and how would you reconcile simple models and complicated models? And it's a good, I think it's a good lead into your question. I think that our research investigations should by and large be testing simple models, simpler models, avoiding elaborate statistical elegance, and avoiding methods that become increasingly hard to permit causal inference, staying away from too much esoterica. On the other hand, I think that every one of our researchers should spend a few hours every week thinking big, complex ideas, which is why it's important for us to read the soft conflict resolution people. We should read them more carefully. We should read more widely, this is going to sound odd, in fiction, more widely. Some people get inspiration out of poetry, I don't, but I do out of fiction. And I also read a lot in contemporary magazines. I go to seminars being put on by other departments, which is another way of saying that the interdisciplinary tradition needs to be maintained and probably expanded. I say that because in the interdisciplinary tradition in American universities is, on the one hand, under assault. On the other hand, there are, let's say, heroic efforts to resurrect it. It's under assault because traditional departments, traditional disciplinary departments, want their people to be good in that discipline.
Right.
And then, of course, the idiotic practice that began now better than 30 years ago of skipping in the American system, skipping the postdoctoral instructorship and going right to the assistant professorship. That means as soon as a young person comes out of graduate school, somebody starts the clock on them. 5, 6 years, 2 books, a dozen articles, if you want to get tenure. This is absolutely idiotic. When I came out, you had 5, 6, 7 years, which you were not expected to publish. You expected to round out your inadequate education. Every graduate education is grossly inadequate. And hone your teaching competence. And I had a very relaxed number of years. If it hadn't been for the fact that Jim Pollack had fired me, and that all of a sudden I was here in the medical school psychiatry department, where I already had some kind of tenure, I would have had a much more hectic early career. I had a very easy career. My early papers, for some reason, clicked. I hardly got any articles rejected in my youth, which was amazing. So that's one thing that's idiotic. We need to give scholars more time. We need to reduce the pressure on them in terms of how much they have to publish. And we certainly need to encourage them to play around with their buddies down the hall. Now at Michigan, there's a very concerted effort. Matter of fact, only last week, the provost put out a very good memo announcing a new series of research grants to encourage people from different departments to collaborate. But it's a very tough road to hoe. If you're supposed to publish fast and you're supposed to stay in your own field, As a matter of fact, I can tell there's a phrase that's around that is really destructive. We lost, for example, a very gifted man in my department. The conventional people say, he doesn't know what he wants to be when he grows up, which is meant to be cute, but it's devastating. It really says, don't mess around with anything outside of your ballpark.
Don't go outside your own field.
Yeah. And of course, I violated that all my life, and have had a lot of fun doing it, and have kind of poked my thumb in the eyes of the fellows who say you shouldn't do it. But I've always had good relations with historians, psychologists, anthropologists, and moderately good relations with economists. I think those of us who teach graduate students should spend a lot more time reminding them that even though that you're in this discipline, your outcome variables can be political or economic or what have you. But you'll never explain them adequately if you only stay to the same discipline for your explanatory variables. So you've got to get out of the box. Economists should be paying more attention to psychology, which is happening. Political scientists should be paying more attention, which they are doing, which I think is bad. We should be paying more attention to psychology and anthropology, in my view. We need to know more about human nature. Remember, the gurus of the old political science, or the world politics side, were basically in agreement with ignorant men like Hans Morgenthau. Uncle Hans, who was a marvelous guy, very smart, knew a lot of history, but he was a Middle European scholar and historian, and he really believed that human nature determines that most human beings are primarily in pursuit of power, and therefore states are in pursuit of power, which utterly ignores the fact that most human beings have a ludicrous streak. A lot of us have a little bit of a playful streak. Fellows like you and I, maybe a little more than normal.
Oh, no. All right, let me go back to something we were saying earlier about influences on the field. A lot of people have established networks within the field and some networks outside the field. Which were your important networks? Which do you think were key networks for you? I mean, you mentioned Karl Deutsch, you mentioned a historical network with works like those of Lewis Fry Richardson and Quincy Wright. But what were important networks for you in your career, do you think?
Well, I was one of the early members of a group called Social Science History Association, which you haven't mentioned.
No.
Its headquarters were largely at Bowling Green University, right down the street in Ohio. And I was an officer of that organization, as was Mel Small, the historian, who was my first major research assistant and first major collaborator. So I was always in pretty good touch with a group of historians. But as you asked the question, it dawned on me, I was never very big at going to conferences. I did my share, and I was never very big on organizations. I always felt that academics can fritter away a lot of their time and energy in organizations. So I belonged to the International Studies Association, which by tradition was interdisciplinary. But I was pretty selective. I didn't hang out with people from any particular crowd. But I liked historians and I liked psychologists. As I mentioned earlier, I was a psychology editor for a while, of background on world politics. You were mentioning Karl Deutsch is important, because Karl always encouraged me to get involved with some of his cronies. And I remember this lunch, for example, with Norbert Wiener. That was, for a young scholar like myself, it was like watching a ping pong match, because Deutsch and Wiener were two very manic, articulate, self-confident men with very delightful ideas. John Platt kept me in better touch with physicists. And at the Mental Health Research Institute, remember, I was the only political scientist there.
True, yes.
Now, my closest associations were with John Platt, the physicist, Dick Meyer, who's kind of an economist sociologist, Bob Crane, who's an Asian historian, Anatole Rappaport, who was not only a mathematician and a biologist, but a pianist.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, if I can digress on this, Anatole, when I started the project, said something to me very profound. He said, Dave, if you think that you're going to come up with a coherent theory to explain war, forget it. It's too complicated. It's going to take too many man years or scholar years. But he said, what you're going to do in your lifetime, you are going to show how foolish much of the conventional wisdom about war and peace is. You are going to disconfirm a lot of the mythology, or words to that effect. And I like to think here and now that I'm entering my 80s, that he was, I'm sorry to say, all too accurate. That is, we're far from a breakthrough, and we have dispatched a fair amount of the phony stuff. Not enough of it, however. That gets into the question of, well, what's our link to the policy relevance and the policy community?
Well, how can we improve that? Do you think we can?
I think it's possible, but I think it's really spitting into the wind, because it would require a policy audience in many countries that takes social science seriously. And you don't find those fellows and girls very place. As we agreed earlier, you don't even find them in the foundations, no less in government agencies. It's kind of ironic. In the very early days of the Journal of Conflict Resolution and the Center at Michigan, you would see the journal on desks in the Pentagon and in the State Department. It looked like a coming fad. Almost none of those subscriptions lasted more than 2 or 3 years. And I can remember there was a young colonel who had the bizarre name. He was a major. They made him a major, and his last name was Minor. So his name was Major Minor, which almost sounded like he came out of...
Catch-22.
Exactly, yes. He was very excited about computer simulation and about a lot of quantitative social science. And he had a unit going in the Pentagon for a while, but some of the academics that he brought in were such fakers. And here I think I will not mention names. I can tell you those off tape, but a number of social scientists who were in the peace research, peace science crowd made some really irresponsible claims. I will paraphrase one that I heard all too often. You give me 3 years and $3 million, Buster, and I'll solve that problem for you. Now, most of the guys who said that, I'm sorry to say, were Republicans who were very good methodologists, but were also opportunists, is my ungenerous take. But there was that, so that a lot of the friendly people, and take the American scene, the State Department had a marvelous team in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. Some of those men and women were sympathetic to our kind of research. Most of them didn't know very much about it. And matter of fact, the chief honcho in state, who was very supportive, but was just so badly educated about social science and scientific method generally. So that's a problem. And many of his colleagues were just brutally hostile. They thought he was just wasting resources and wasting his time. And I still remember an article written by Charles Burton Marshall, who used to teach at Johns Hopkins. And he read some of my papers. And that led him, and then we were on a panel together, remember, led him to write a scathing article called something like Waiting for the Curtain. And his metaphor was that all we would ever do is rehearsing and improving our methods and playing around, but we wouldn't produce anything valuable. And it was part of the sense that we were very slow getting out of the stops. But that's not surprising. It's not like we were building on a solid historical tradition. We were inventing the methods. We were inventing a new science, if you will. And I know that I devoted probably the first half of my career, I would say half of my time and energy was devoted to figuring out ways to observe and measure the variables that we thought might be important. And we published a book many years later called Measuring the Correlates of War, which I edited with Paul Deal, one of my very good students. And the book has never really caught on, which is too bad. It's because it shows you the pioneering effort.